Whatever distractions candidates promote to win voters, some underlying issues will wield their influence on 2020 election outcomes in any case. The biggest of these are the historically accumulated anger and betrayal felt by millions of working-class Americans. Since the 1970s, their relative position within income and wealth distributions has declined. Real wages stagnated, while workers' rising productivity made ever more profits for employers, widening inequality. That alone depressed the class, but U.S. society is structured to add many political, cultural, and social demotions onto those whose relative economic position declines. As stagnant real wages constricted workers' consumption growth, political supports, from government programs to politicians' attentions, shrank. Shifting cultural norms, smartphones, fashionable bars, fancy sports arenas, etc., entailed new costs that were increasingly unaffordable. Rising consumer debt, mortgages, car loans, credit card balances, only partly offset the new costs. Yet that debt also raised new kinds and degrees of financial anxieties. A central social promise of post-World War II America, that working-class children could expect, prepare for, and graduate from college, began to erode. Declining state support for higher education institutions forced more of their costs onto students, just as working-class families' relative income and wealth positions fell. Student debt burdens exploded and stressed working-class families from another direction. Debt-hobbled young people could not leave home, start new families, or become self-reliant. Self-blame about that, plus reliance on parents and fast-mounting debt anxieties, further problematized working-class households. Results included the opioid crisis, rising rates of suicide, mass shootings, and psychological depression. Working-class feelings of betrayal and anger had an important historical root that some understood, but most only implicitly sensed. Something seemed to have changed in America, to have been different before. Trump's caricature MAGA slogan touched a nerve even as it mystified what made that nerve so sensitive. Certain aspects of U.S. history do matter deeply in the upcoming election. The U.S. had survived the Great Depression of the 1930s by means of government policies that included massive fiscal stimuli. Some of them took the form of new social programs targeting most of the American people, although distorted by racial, gender, and other discriminations. These included the Social Security system, unemployment compensation, and the federal hiring of millions of the unemployed. To these must be added key legislation, the first minimum wage law and the National Labor Relations Act. Together, these actions realized a rise in the relative position of the working class within the distributions of income and wealth. More than that, they initiated the idea that this was indeed a new deal for the country, a new path forward. U.S. society's commitment to that path seemed secure in the life of Franklin Roosevelt's unprecedented successive election victories. The U.S. working class understood that the Republican Party was not its friend. It tilted heavily towards the Democratic Party, except for some who could be distracted by appeals to racist, religious, anti-immigrant, and/or ethnic commitments, old staples of U.S. politics. The working class came to expect that the attention, support, and real help it got from the Democratic Party under FDR would prevail. Republicans, it presumed, would not dare stray very far from the 1930s dominant themes. And even if they did, the Democratic Party would come roaring back to set things straight again. An American dream seemed well within reach for the U.S. working class. By and large, the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s reinforced such working-class expectations, notwithstanding rising demands of African Americans and other marginalized groups for inclusion in what had been provided chiefly to the white male working class. The federal government led the way with job-creating infrastructure projects, public housing, highways, and the like. State governments created a public higher education system geared toward the working class. Genuine but slow headway was made towards broader social inclusion. The New Left in the 1960s implicitly acknowledged the situation by prioritizing its demands for both fuller and faster inclusion of the formerly marginalized. Everything changed in the 1970s. Defeats and setbacks earlier, for example, the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act undermining labor unions, intensified to become a general betrayal of the U.S. working class. Enough time had passed since the 1930s to enable corporate America to shift gears from its earlier evasions and weakening of the New Deal. Corporations and their allies undertook a frontal assault aimed at its total repeal. With Reagan, the Republican Party moved to the right, and the Democratic Party began moving into the space thereby vacated. Both parties increasingly shared commitments to what came to be called neoliberalism. They diverged chiefly around the pace for government intervention in the economy to be reduced, tax cuts, deregulation, etc., and reliance on private enterprises and free markets to be increased. Republicans were in a rush. Democrats wanted to go more slowly, helping victims of the rightward political economy shift to cope and adjust to it. The frontal assault took the form of policies supporting, mostly uncritically, the three initiatives of corporate America to get out from under the New Deal's limitations on their profitability. The first of these took advantage of two contemporary technical changes, the jet engine and modern telecommunications. One enabled corporate executives easily and quickly to traverse the globe, while the other enabled corporate real-time oversight and control of operations anywhere on the globe from U.S. headquarters. Together, these breakthroughs enabled the boldest U.S. manufacturers to move production to foreign locations, much more than had been the case before. The far lower wages abroad and local governments desperate to bring jobs enabled huge profits for the arriving U.S. firms. That then forced their competitors to join the export of jobs from the U.S. ever since. Republicans enthusiastically, and then Democrats more hesitantly, embraced U.S. capitalism's profit-driven globalization. The second corporate initiative came from capitalists who could not easily move overseas, for example, in many service industries. They boosted profits by bringing low-wage foreign workers into the U.S., major new immigration waves, especially from Latin America. The third initiative entailed capitalists installing computers, then robots, and now artificial intelligence in a massive program of labor-saving technical change. Jobs exported or lost to automation, plus rising supplies of immigrants entering the U.S. labor force, contributed to the real hourly wage stagnation ever since. That was definitely not what the U.S. working class had come to expect emerging from the New Deal. As stagnating wages hindered workers from realizing the American dream after the 1970s, their feelings of betrayal were temporarily held in check by two working-class responses. First, stagnant real wages helped drive millions of women into the paid labor market, adding to competition for jobs. Second, working-class families borrowed more. On top of mortgage and car loans, U.S. consumers added massive new credit card and finally student debts. These enabled and sustained rising working-class consumption over the century's last quarter. The class could still strain toward the American dream, even if doing so was increasingly dependent on multiple wage earners per household and on raising debt. Meanwhile, stagnant wages plus debt fueled a boom in global capitalism. The stock market bubbled, enriching the top 10% and reinforcing the celebration of neoliberalism by both Republicans and centrist Democrats. They believed their own hype about a new economy, a new normal, the end of ideology, that is, socialism, and so on. Capitalist utopianism was in fashion. I'm old enough to have watched this myself, and as the article suggests, the situation in my youth would never have envisioned the succession of debts and housewives working outside the home and other things that seem common now and would have been unthinkable in the 1950s and 60s. The expanding debt proved to be a bubble that eventually burst, first around the dot-com craze in 2000, and then in 2008's major collapse. The U.S. working class was shocked 3 times in quick succession. First, the promise of rising standards of living was now definitely broken. Wages were flat, debt levels had reached unsustainable levels, and families and households were exhausted. The postponed reality of an American dream fading out of reach began to sink in. Second, the working class watched Republicans and Democrats falling over one another in and after 2008 to give big finance and big business every possible taxing, spending, and regulatory support, mostly at taxpayer expense. Concerns about deficits, long a staple of conservatives, disappeared. The idea of boosting the economy from below disappeared as well. Everything was trickled down in economics, no matter how little trickled. Millions of underwater homeowners were promised a help that never arrived. The final blow came after trillions had been spent to revive a near-dead capitalist class. The problem of rising deficits was rediscovered to rationalize an austerity program for the masses. For them, we simply can't afford it. These three shocks proved too much for large sections of the U.S. working class. They expected little from Republicans, but felt betrayed by Democrats. The Democrats could and should have stopped it, but the party was too weak or too embedded in the neoliberal status quo to be of any use. The entire Washington apparatus, both parties, were jointly responsible. Working class anger against them spilled over to the media that protected them by taking their lip services seriously rather than exposing and condemning their betrayals. Of course, large numbers stayed with the Democratic Party because they saw it as the lesser evil. But others, more than enough to swing many elections, were ready and eager for someone in either party who could and would express their anger and sense of betrayal against both major party establishments. Trump did that far more sharply and clearly than Sanders. Both stayed within their respective parties, but Trump's break from his party's old establishment was much more confrontational, as in his aggressive nationalism, expressed in gross hostilities against immigrants, foreign trading partners, allies, etc. We've seen an example of that going on in England at the moment. It underscored a break with the capitalist globalization that Republicans had endorsed. In contrast, Sanders' identification as socialist, certainly an important break from Democratic Party tradition, shocked many who'd been indoctrinated for the last half-century with the demonization of that concept. Sanders' economic platform, advocating a Green New Deal, also was more a progressive version of classical Democratic Party positions than a break from them. Centrist Democrats had repeated lip service to such positions while ignoring them in practice. Similar feelings of betrayal turned European working classes against their old parties, culminating in the May 2019 European parliamentary elections. There, too, Trump-like figures, Farage in the UK, Salvini in Italy, and so on, marked sharp extreme nationalist confrontations with the old center-right. Meanwhile, much less sharp confrontation characterized the new left's relations with the old center-left of the established socialist parties. Thus, the new left is largely green and vaguely anti-capitalist, more progressive than the old socialists, but in degree, not in kind. In but one instance so far, France's yellow vests, a potential exists for the left to find new modes of expression and mobilization adequate to confront and defeat the right. That's a discussion that's going on at the moment. I had a long talk with a friend of mine just back from spending a couple of months in Paris, and he claims that the yellow vests hardly exist. Now, that's consistent with his politics beforehand, but there's a sense in which their existence is still a matter of debate. In both Europe and the U.S., the most angry and betrayed sections of the working class preferred the sharper confrontations with and breaks from the old political establishment. Trump's nasty tweets, much like Farage, Salvini's intemperate outbursts, suited their mood, won their votes, and continued to build support among them. The example of the yellow vest could do something parallel on the left. The 2020 election in the U.S. will be a next big opportunity to express both sorts of working class feelings. The history summarized above holds lessons for 2020. A return to the past in Democratic Party rhetoric, symbolism, and personalities, such as Biden, is a recipe to repeat political mistakes and losses since 2016. Biden will likely lose for the Democrats, as the comparably backward-looking Bob Dole did for the Republicans in 1996. Dole perhaps learned the lesson and eventually endorsed Trump, the only former Republican presidential nominee to do so. Another lesson is that Sanders is the Democrats' best hope unless and until other plausible candidates take clear, strong positions to Sanders' left. One such position might articulate the working class's sufferings as systematically derived from a declining capitalism and thus propose system change as a solution, such as change to an economy based on worker co-ops instead of hierarchical capitalist firms. Such positions would provide on the left more attractive, bold, and new plans than what Trump offers on the right. Staying inside the Democratic Party is also dangerous for Sanders, or someone further left, chances. Running as a Democrat carries very negative associations for voters, even if it benefits from what remains of the party's electoral machinery and from the hardcore base that votes Democratic no matter what, and what other fiddles the Democratic National Committee can put into the system. Politics is changing fast in the U.S. now. Lenin's remark that for decades nothing seems to happen, and then in a few months decades happen, applies yet again. Socialism is being rediscovered and readmired, as Gallup and other polls show clearly. Given the U.S.'s last half-century repression of teaching seriously about or even publicly expressing socialist ideas, debates, and programs, the rediscovery process is working quickly through the old left Democratic Party ideas, the old left Keynesian economics, etc. Newly excited young socialists are already testing and moving beyond those limits. Different ways of understanding and institutionalizing socialist movements will emerge soon as the initial celebration of democratic socialism matures into different socialist orientations. How the Democratic Party manages the 2020 election will not only show whether it understands the lessons of history, it will also influence the pace and details of the emerging new socialist left. Finally, because of that socialist left's size, momentum, and its support in the general population, especially among the young, what it becomes will importantly influence all the rest of U.S. politics in ways not seen for the last half-century. That's a piece by Richard Wolff, the economist. I'll put a link to it on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, which is what you're listening to at the moment. Also, C.J. Hopkins writes, back in January 2018, I wrote this piece about the war on dissent, which, in case you haven't noticed, is going gangbusters. As predicted, the global capitalist ruling classes have been using every weapon in their arsenal to marginalize, stigmatize, delegitimize, and otherwise eliminate any and all forms of dissent from neoliberal ideology, and in particular from their new official narrative, democracy versus the Putin Nazis. For over 2 years, the corporate media have been pounding out an endless series of variations on this major theme, namely that democracy is under attack by a conspiracy of Russians and neo-Nazis that magically materialized out of the ether during the summer of 2016. The intelligence agencies, political elites, academia, celebrities, social media personalities, and other organs of the culture industry have been systematically reifying this official narrative through constant repetition. The Western masses have been inundated with innumerable articles, editorials, television news, and talk show segments, books, social media posts, and various other forms of messaging, whipping up hysteria over Russians and fascists. At this point, it's no longer just propaganda. It's become the new truth. It has become reality. Becoming reality, of course, the ultimate goal of every ideology. An ideology is just a system of ideas, and it's thus fair game for critique and dissent. Reality is not fair game for dissent. It's not up for debate or challenge, not by serious, legitimate people. Reality is simply the way it is. It's axiomatic. It's apathegmatic. It's not a belief or an interpretation. It's not subject to change or revision. It's the immortal, immutable Word of God, or whatever deity or deity-like concept the ruling classes and the masses they rule accept as the final arbiter of truth. In our case, this would be science or reason rather than something supernatural. But in terms of ideology, there isn't much difference. Every system of belief, regardless of its nature, ultimately depends on political power and power relations to enforce its beliefs, which is to say, to make them real. Okay, whenever I write about reality and truth, I get a few rather angry responses from folks who appear to think I'm denying the existence of objective reality. I'm not. For example, this chair I'm sitting on is absolutely part of objective reality, a physical object that actually exists. The screen you're probably reading these words on, or the television you're listening to them through, is also part of objective reality. I'm not saying there is no reality. What I'm saying is reality is a concept invented and developed by people, a concept that serves a variety of purposes, some philosophical, some political, and it's the political purposes I'm interested in. Think of reality as an ideological tool, a tool in the hands of those with the power to designate what is real and what isn't. Doctors, teachers, politicians, police, scientists, priests, pundits, experts, parents, these are the enforcers of reality. The powerless do not get to decide what is real. Ask a Palestinian living in Gaza, or the mother of a black kid the cops shot for no reason. Ask Julian Assange. Ask the families of those enemy combatants Obama droned. Ask the conspiracy theorists on Twitter, digitally screaming at anyone who will listen about what is and isn't the truth. Each of them will give you their version of reality, and you and I may agree with some of them, and some of their beliefs may be supported with facts, but that will not make what they believe reality. Power is what makes reality reality, not facts, not evidence, not knowledge, power. Those in power or aligned with those in power or parroting the narratives of those in power understand this, whether consciously or not. Those without power mostly do not, and thus we continue to speak truth to power as if those in power cared. They don't. The powerful are not arguing with us. They're not attempting to win a debate about what is and isn't true, or what did or didn't really happen. They are declaring what did or didn't happen. They're telling us what is and is not reality, and demonstrating what happens to those who disagree. Think of Julian Assange. The democracy versus the Putin Nazis narrative is our new reality, whether we like it or not. It does not matter one iota that there is zero evidence to support this narrative other than the claims of intelligence agencies, politicians, the corporate media, and other servants of the ruling classes. The Russians are attacking democracy because the ruling classes tell us they are. Fascism is on the march again because the ruling classes say it is. Anyone who disagrees is a Putin sympathizer, a Putin apologist, or linked to Russia, or favored by Russia, or an anti-Semite, or a fascist apologist. Question the official narrative about the gratuitously baby-gassing monster of Syria, not in fact a nice guy, and you're an Assad apologist, a Russian bot network, or a plagiarizing red-brown infiltrator. Criticize the corporate media for disseminating cheap McCarthyite smears, and you're a Tulsi-standing Hindu Nazi apologist. God help you if you should appear on Fox, in which case you're a Nazi legitimizer. A cursory check of the internet today revealed that far-right Facebook groups are spreading hate to millions in Europe by means of some sort of hypnogenic content that just looking at it turns you into a Nazi. Our democracy-loving friends at the Atlantic Council are disappointed by Trump's refusal to sign the Christchurch Call, a multilateral statement encouraging corporations to censor the internet. And fascism is fashionable even in Italy again. This post-Orwellian neo-McCarthyite mass hysteria is not going to stop. Not until the global capitalist ruling classes have suppressed the current populist insurgency and restored normality throughout the Western world. Until then, it's going to be pretty much nonstop democracy versus the Putin Nazis. So unless you're enjoying our new reality, or are willing to conform to it for some other reason, prepare to be smeared as a Russian-loving, Putin-apologizing conspiracy theorist, or a fascism-enabling, Trump-loving Nazi, or some other type of insidiously Slavic, white supremacist, mass murder enthusiast. Things are only going to get uglier as the American election season ramps up. I mean, come on. You don't really believe that the global capitalist ruling classes are going to let Trump serve a second term, do you? You're listening to Aware on the Air. We're talking about the conditions for American war-making. We'll conclude today with a video in which Chris Hedges interviews Green Party member Howie Hawkins on third parties in U.S. politics, not, of course, part of American political reality. Hedges rightly offers a sharp critique of the Democratic Green New Deal, both in terms of its origin and the Democratic Party version which bows to corporate power. Hedges also rightly criticizes Bernie Sanders on Sanders' unwillingness to challenge rampant militarism. Hawkins is currently forming a presidential exploratory committee to see if he should run for president on the Green Party ticket. By happy coincidence, this show goes together well with Black Agenda Report's Bruce A. Dixon on how there's no future in working with the Democrats or repairing them from within. The truth is that Trump is only marginally worse than either Republicans or Democrats. Obama extended U.S. Special Ops troops and drone bases to every nation on the African continent except Zimbabwe and Eritrea, and saved the banks here at home. While hundreds of thousands of black mortgage holders were evicted, something a Republican president can never get away with, Bill Clinton jacked the black prison population up to an all-time high of 1 million. Nevertheless, we hear a lot of chatter from people like our leftist friends at DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, about Trump is so bad, so evil, and so awful that absolutely any Democrat would be better for the good of the planet and especially for the good of the people at the very bottom of North America's economic and social pyramid. Those are real people, the argument goes, and we owe them a vote for any Democrat because they just cannot afford to be hurt any more than they're already being hurt. Therefore, the argument holds that poor people building a third party with their own votes, their own labor, and financed by their own membership dues, like poor people do in every other nation on this planet, is a bad idea, something the poor and oppressed here cannot and should not even try. After all, the ballot access portion of such an effort alone would take 1 million signatures and might split the Democratic Party, electing a Republican to the presidency. It's hard to miss the reeking racism and classism of this nonsensical proposition. Aren't poor people smart enough to make their own choices, not just for this year, but for years ahead, if that's what it takes? The left will never become a mass phenomenon in this country until it raises up to its own voices and funds its own independent political party. Despite what our friends at DSA tell us and tell each other, that will not happen inside either one of the billionaires' parties, and it won't be funded by the people who fund those parties. That's Bruce Dixon from the excellent Black Agenda Report. Aware on the Air is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Crofton Coleman, with Andrew Scholarly and Ethan Young. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. We rely on a researcher, Jeff Nicholson, whose blog, Digital Citizen, we recommend highly. We steal from it regularly. There's a link to it on our Facebook page. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly our own liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and unconstitutional attacks on the free press, notably in the case of WikiLeaks. Now, this is Carl Estabrook, the members and friends of Aware, wishing everyone Eid Mubarak at the conclusion of Ramadan, and saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.